one of the view plants that starts out with double-sided leaves is the rubber plant. So you can load that in right-clicking on the tree icon, and this is located in grasses and plants, where we have our rubber plant. Now, first thing you'll notice about the rubber plant is that the OpenGL preview for the leaves does not show the color or the transparency or alpha clip map. That can make it a little difficult to work with this, especially with double-sided leaves. We're going to take a look at a way to be able to see that in the OpenGL. So I'll just do a quick preview render. We can see the rubber plant. And looking at it from the top, a little more vibrant green. If we move underneath and take a look at the undersides, it's something that's a lot lighter, which is part of the material. Now, it is possible to achieve these double-sided leaves without losing the OpenGL preview. So first, let's take a look at why it is being destroyed. So if we select the rubber plant, and I'm sorting by type right now, we can see and navigate over to the leaf, or we can move over to the Textures tab, and in the lower right we have a scale option. We can scale the materials up and down, so we can see under the plant material list the ficus leaf, which is for the rubber plant, which has the mixed material icon, and then we can see the bottom and the top. So if I double click on the ficus leaf, it's going to open up the material editor. And the distribution of these two materials is controlled with the influence of environment. By checking on the distribution of materials dependent on local slope, altitude, and orientation, it enables all of these options. This plant mainly is controlled by the slope, where we have the strongest at 100%, and material 2, which is the top leaf appearing on flat surfaces. And that really is the primary control. Most of these other settings, even though some of them, the near azimuth for the influence of orientation, that really has no effect because there is no influence. Altitude, it's set to 2%, but I've changed it around a bit and really haven't seen an impact from manipulating that. So really, I mean, it's just using the slope. Well, that's something that is easily available within a single material rather than having to use two. So the top leaf is the main material. If we take a look, just previewing it as a function, what we have is the color, bump, transparency map. Go ahead, and I'm going to, at the upper left, select preview options and change to 2D plane. And that way it's a lot easier to work with leaf materials, any sort of texture map. If you take a look, the interpolation type is going to be set to none on the color and the transparency, but it will be turned on for the bump. And you always want to use an interpolation type of bilinear on bump and anything connected to highlight. And really any sort of output that's going to be influenced by the lighting of the scene or anything tied into that, because otherwise you're going to get a lot of pixelation. So if we take a look at the bottom leaf, which is actually set up as material 1. Material 1 is the bottom, 2 is the top. You can swap them if you wanted to have it the other way around. We'll just do a quick preview. Now we'll see the darker leaves and the more vibrant green on the bottom. Of course, with that backlight comes much more intense, and then the top of the leaves are now the lighter color that we have. So go ahead and swap that back. We're going to take a look at material 1, which is the bottom, and what is being done is a color blend to this lighter green with an inverted color map. So all that's done is just invert the color, and that's really the only change. If we take a look at the bump map, even the bump map is the same. We could invert the bump map as well, and that way we could have the stem showing up a little different. And now it's probably too difficult for you to tell with the size of this render, but there's a common issue with every plant in view, or just about every single one, and it has to do with the bump map. Basically, one half of the plant will show it correctly, and the other half will show it inverted. Even when using the double-sided leaf materials, whether it's the default view one, which is using a mixed material, or the one I'm going to show you. So both of them have issues, and there's something really interesting that even happens beyond the typical slope influence with a mixed material. We'll be looking at that a little closer in just a little bit here. I do want to note I am rendering with radiosity. If we go ahead up to the atmosphere editor, you can F4 on the keyboard, a lot better of a shortcut. Taking a look in the light tab, of course I'm using a spectral model, which has pretty much become the new default. What I have turned off is the optimize for outdoor rendering when I'm using radiosity. This will create a much better looking render, although it does take a little longer to calculate the pre-pass. So that's something to keep in mind. I have the quality boost turned down to -1.5. Whenever I'm using stills or doing any sort of still render, I always turn down the quality boost because a lot of the exact lighting doesn't need to be perfect on the plants. It really becomes more important on terrains, really getting that lighting correct. But when you've got an ecosystem and you just want it to render fast and look good, you can turn down the quality boost and get a pretty quick render. If you take a look on the Xylifex website, a lot of the plant collections I created, tropical plants and the ground cover collection, so we have the jungle and rainforest collection, ground cover, and a lot of the renders I created pretty much for the website. Just kind of doing some quick ecosystems. Almost none of those renders took any bit longer than 5 minutes to render. Using these settings, it's really rather quick and looks pretty good. I do want to note I do have the auto exposure on. If we look at the camera, I also want to note I am using a slightly modified version of Camera Orbiter. So we can see the auto exposure is turned on just by double clicking on the active camera. We can pull this up. Just because with this off it's going to be a very dark scene. If we go back to the atmosphere editor, take a look. The light balances, I've got Sky Dome lighting gain up 0.4 and a slightly modified default sky scene. Now, Camera Orbiter is part of Snowflake. So if you do own Snowflake, using a fixed setting of Camera Orbiter, we'll go ahead and take a look at the graph for Orbiter loaded in. I'm using the fixed mode instead of the dynamic. I have a fixed length set, since this becomes available when you're using the fixed mode and not the dynamic. And this will keep the pivot point pretty much stationary. I am using the pitch zoom. Basically, this allows me to really easily just kind of orbit around just the plant I'm working on. Z movement sensitivity at 0.5, my length set to 2, and I'm using the constraint, or the constraint is turned off. If you want to position it, actually we'll go ahead and we'll select the camera. We're going to go to the numerics tab, select the pivot point, turn it on, and all I did was just position in the 4 viewports. And just move the camera so that that pivot point shows up in the center, which is the projected pivot from the camera, basically to the center of the scene. With the dynamic mode, that will update and change, but with the fixed mode, that will pretty much stay the same except when you're pitching up and down, depending on those settings. But this creates a very nice little plant creator, and that way you can kind of navigate around much easier without having to worry about using the main camera preview and all of the controls. So let's take a look at how we're going to build this in a single material, so we don't have to worry about setting that up with a mixed material. We can get back the OpenGL preview. So we're going to select the rubber plant, we can go to the material, or you can select the material tab, open it up. Now what I want to do is switch this over, change it to a simple material. First, what I want to do is swap it. Whichever material is material 1 is the one that is going to be preserved, not material 2, that will be deleted. I do want to note there is a slight difference between these two with the effect setting, mainly the contrast. And other than that, that's really the only change, besides a little bit of a bump depth difference, where the top of the leaf has a lower bump because it's hitting more light, and the bottom has what is really quite high considering the quality of the image used to create the bump. It is a very low res image, and it is also a GIF file, which is probably one of the worst formats to use for bump. 16-bit grayscale PNG files are by far the best. Low file size, and you really can't turn the bump up this high without getting a lot of pixelation when you're close up, unless you have a 16-bit file. You might be able to get away with 32-bit if you're using EXR format, but it is more difficult to create the maps you need at that sort of bit depth. So let's go to the main material. We're going to swap, turn it to a simple material, and then we can edit the function. Another thing you could do, if you're not familiar with the shortcut, is if you're holding down the control key and you click on the function preview, it will open up the function editor. So that's a nice little quick shortcut. So what we need to do is preserve this for the OpenGL, and also be able to create a double-sided leaf. Anytime you disrupt these connections and the links that we have going to the output, it will destroy the OpenGL. So if I was to create a blender and set it up that way, it's immediately going to break the OpenGL, which you've already seen with the mixed material, which just is not compatible with it. But we do have an option of color blend. So I'm going to turn on the color blend, and you can see if I start to blend with the color right now, the default is black. What I'm going to do is right click on the overall color, and now if it is modified, you will have to reset it first. Turn off the color blend first, and just make sure you don't see that white box. Copy the color, turn on the color blend, and just paste the color in. And this is just a good starting point. Now it is going to darken the material because it's blending, even with color mask. You start to get some interesting things going on. But we'll be correcting that. So once the color blend is on, if we edit the function, we have a node where it'll add in the color blending node in between the color texture map and the color output. This gives us the ability to connect anything we want to the color. So our blending color right now is defined by whatever we copied and pasted over. But really what we want to do is extract it. So now we have a constant color, which we can replace with pretty much anything. And there are also a couple of different ways we can set this up. Let's look at the shortest solution and the quickest method. Not necessarily going to be the best, because results will vary depending on the way you have it set up. But let's just go ahead and take a look. What we can do is just using basically these nodes. I'm going to select the texture map, just selecting it, and then clicking over in a blank area just to get that red box. And if we go over here to the left and add a texture map, it will copy the one we currently have. You could also just select it, copy and paste. But I'm going to grab from the bottom here, constant color, and connect, making sure we're inside that little highlighted circle. And we can delete the constant color that was generated. So now we can modify this color link and basically do whatever we want with it. So being able to manipulate the color blend and extracting it to bring it into other functions allows us to preserve the OpenGL, which is quite nice. So what I want to do is select this link, and we can add either a color blending node, but because that was the last type of color node we had selected, within color correction, we can select any of these to modify the color. If we do an HLS color shift, we can disconnect it automatically and then have to reconnect it. Really depending on the node you select, sometimes it'll disconnect, sometimes it will stay connected. So we have a shift color, and we can modify this, maybe make it red. So that creates a fairly interesting look. Actually, something that's probably a little more realistic, depending on the lighting situation. And what we can do is control our blending ratio. Now, this is going to be the most important part, and there are different ways of controlling this blending ratio. And I'm not going to be sticking with this color. I am instead going to choose a perspective color. And let's choose something that's mainly going to stand out, just so you really see what's showing up. Let's use kind of a rust color. And now the other way we could set this up, or the two different ways, is either to control our blending ratio of this main color blend, or to set up a blend or a combiner node and use the numeric control to control that ratio. So whether or not you want it connected directly to this color blend, it's really going to depend on the output you're looking for. So we'll take a look at both options, and they will appear differently because of the way the color blend works. And unfortunately, we are restricted to this color blend in order to preserve the OpenGL. If you're not worried about the OpenGL and you don't care about it, then I guess it doesn't really matter. But it can be extremely helpful and require a lot less preview renders. So what we want to do is connect this ratio to the slope up at the top. Now we do need to define this slope a little bit better. Just a direct slope connection is not going to work. And in order to really see this, what we need to do is change this over. Let's go ahead up to sphere for the preview. Otherwise we're not going to be able to see the altitude, or the slope changes from the top and the bottom. And what I want to do is select this connection and add in a filter. Right now it's just a basic filter. What I do want to use is the smooth threshold. You could also use the threshold. The only problem is that leaves aren't always necessarily going to be perfectly straight up or down. And if they are drooping, you're going to get a very harsh cutoff between the two areas where it starts to blend. So the smooth threshold gives you a gradient to be so you can basically manipulate the overall color. There is a couple other nodes we do need to add in because we do have a very harsh line showing up. Anyway, that can be pretty easily taken care of. First, let's just take a look at it as it is right now. Also keeping in mind that when I switched the mixed material and turned it into a simple, it did reset the scale. Now the scale of leaves, in order to get them to show up properly, and even though it's an object standard mode, it really works more like parametric, where it fits to the shape and size of the leaf polygon. And it's actually set up at 0.34. So your scale for your leaves needs to be 0.34, which was the scale of the mixed material. But since the materials within the mixed material were set to 1, when I removed the mix, it removed the mix scale. And now it does look like I have this reversed. So at the moment, actually, I'm going to go ahead and switch this just to a preview. And we'll be able to see the red on top and the green on the bottom. And we also see that the OpenGL, although it doesn't show the color blend, it is showing the leaves and giving us a good idea of what it looks like, which is going to be really helpful. Because otherwise we might as well still be working in wireframe views. So if we want to reverse this effect and make it so the red is on the bottom, it's actually pretty easy. We're going to go back and select the material, and all we need to do is invert the slope. Now I do want to do this before I get to the threshold filter. So we're going to add in another filter, which will automatically become the smooth threshold because I just had it selected. But we want to change that to the opposite -x. Now this is going to create a slightly different output. So we may also need to modify and add another filter, and we can use the offset. And it actually might need to go before it, because it does look like the overall output, if we take a look at the node preview, unfortunately slope doesn't really show up well with this, if at all. Now it should have basically given us an exact match, and let's just take a look and render first before I make any severe changes. But it does look like the red really isn't showing as much as it was before. So we'll be making just a couple of modifications. If not, all we need to do is just kind of reverse the way we modify the color, and that's where the other method comes in. So one way we could switch this, still using this method, is to switch around these options. The only thing is, it's probably going to destroy the OpenGL preview, and we can see it did. We still have the transparency showing up, which is still helpful. So if you really do need to make just a quick modification this way, and it doesn't look like it was an exact reversal, just because of the way the lighting works on the top compared to the way the backlight works. So let's take a look at the other method to be able to really get the lighting we want, to really reverse it. So go ahead and switch these. And instead of controlling the ratio of these two, I'm instead going to control a blender or a combiner node. So we're going to click in here, add a combiner, which is set to blender. And we can choose the original texture map to mix it with, and then control the ratio with the smooth threshold. Now I am going to add in those other nodes I was talking about, which is basically to add in two filters. One is going to be our ceiling and the max height, and the other one is going to be the floor. Set the floor to -1, set the ceiling to 1, connect the floor to the ceiling, and we can disconnect the ratio from the smooth threshold to the floor and ceiling up to the smooth threshold. So we're going to see that's giving the effect we want. And now we can start to see that red showing up a lot more on the bottom, and more of that kind of rusty orange color. We may need to make a few more modifications. We can adjust that threshold amount. So going back to the smooth threshold, you can adjust the transition. But to show you why the transition is important, let's go ahead and just break this. I'm going to turn off the transition amount, which is basically going to give us just the threshold, or the threshold node that is available. And if we select the plant, edit the object, and now over in the leaves we want to increase flexibility, and then for the stem subset we're going to take droop and really turn that to a higher amount. And we'll see if that was just enough to break it. And it does look like in some of these areas it is really showing this harsh line. For the most part, it is okay. It is an object-based output, based object slope, so it's pretty much okay. But in some cases we will run into that problem. And you can see in a few spots we do have where that slope is really high and it's thinking that it's the bottom of the leaf. So we'll go back, and we just want to get rid of that harsh line. I'll go ahead and zoom in. Since I'm using Orbiter, I don't want to move the camera because that'll change the pivot. So just zooming in and out will work. You can see the harsh lines are pretty clear now. So all we need to do is just use that threshold and really fine-tune that setting. I've been using 0.65 or 0.6, sometimes going a little bit larger to get a nice blend or fade. Now it will start to transition into that color, but it won't be a harsh line at least. And this also happens with the mixed material. And the smooth blending strip and part of the mix between which surfaces you have the slider turned to creates this sort of a transition. So let's get something that's a little more vibrant. And I am going to make the leaves a little longer. And go back into the material. And now the overall blend amount, if we go to color blend 100%, that's going to give us a really, really intense color. So now we have this really vibrant red showing behind the leaves. And let's go ahead and find our sunlight. And just put the plant in front of it. And now we can see the backlight, which is showing correctly as this nice red. The hooking point is a little bit off. And since I didn't modify the leaves, that means that the hooking point of the base species is a little off. And in another part of the training, I'm going to specifically talk about these hooking points and how they change, because unfortunately there is a hooking point bug with almost every species, and it just does not want to remember where you set your hooking point. There are a few ways to get around that. We'll take a look at that in another area in the bug section. Now we can see the hooking point showing up a little bit better. We do have that transition in some of those areas, but that is partially caused by the image map, because it does have a very light edge around it. Now we can also set this to color mask, and in this case it's going to give us almost exactly the output that we have in the function, but it will create some strange results with the backlight, and that does need to be fine-tuned a little bit more. But we can see the top of the leaf now looks more like it did before, but the color blend and then that transition and smooth blend, this is just way too red. We would need to tone it down, or really decrease the intensity. An easy way to do that, a really easy way actually, is just to go into that floor node we created and increase the negative amount. So instead of going from -1, we can set it to 0. And in this case, it gives us really more of what we were looking at in the color, that kind of a rusty color. So instead of going between a value of -1 and +1, in this case it ends up being a little better to use 0 to 1. And the transition amount, in this case, with this harsh of a contrast and with the leaves really drooping like this, like I said, that doesn't happen a whole lot of the time, but what we might need to do is adjust that threshold and the transition amount. You can also change the threshold if you want to bring it down a little bit more. Let's do a negative 0.05 just to bring it down slightly. And having that transition amount turned up all the way, you can really play around with it, fine-tune it, do a lot of different things with it, really get some nice color changes, and of course preserve the OpenGL. But also, it can be difficult to work with a mixed material. If you want to have some similarities on the leaves, you have to keep switching back and forth between material 1, material 2, copying and pasting different settings over, and this way you can just have it all in one material. It makes it a lot easier. I do want to make a quick note about the backlight before we move on, and basically the intensity of a backlight will be controlled by, of course, the backlight amount. If you're not familiar with it, in the effects tab, lower left, backlight, which allows light to shine through the surface. If I turn it off, we're only going to see the indirect lighting, so it is still lit up just because I have radiosity turned on. So we do have bounced light coming from the kind of stage object I created underneath. But the backlight, it's sort of a translucency. So instead of actually having to use translucency, we can use the backlight amount and make it glow. Now this is connected to the sunlight shadow. If I turn up and increase my shadow amount, I had it set to 80. So let's go ahead and increase it to 100. You're going to see a decreased effect where the shadows are hitting the leaves, which is pretty much going to be everywhere always. And if this is too dark, which it pretty much always is, because that default value of 100 is just way too high. You should almost never use the value of 100. Anywhere between 70 and 80 usually works pretty good. Sometimes what you can do if you're working with a light balance, if we go ahead and open up the atmosphere editor, where we have a light balance amount, sometimes you can achieve a really nice effect by balancing the shadow with the ambient light amount, kind of subtracting from it. So if I was to have an ambient light amount of 30, I could usually get a nice effect by taking the shadow density and setting it to 70. So between those two, we have a total value of 100%. Now, that isn't always going to work for everything, but in a lot of cases when you're using a radiosity render, it does produce a really nice effect. And even in the other modes, if we go ahead and switch this to global ambience rather than radiosity, we can still see something that's going to look a lot better than those really, really harsh shadows. Because as the shadows build up, they are still going to darken and make areas of the plants very almost black. But it just creates another way to kind of balance that out. So backlight is tied to the shadow and its overall intensity. So if we were to go over 100%, we would see almost completely black in the back.